Good afternoon. I'm taken back, although in a different house of worship, but I'm taken back to my acolyte days in the Episcopal Church where I grew up. So I hope not to mess this up, but I was always encouraged that nobody knew the difference and just walk the walk and talk the talk and it would all be fine. So good afternoon. It is such a pleasure to be with you this afternoon with so many things that you could have done with your time today. It touches my heart deeply, and I'm greatly appreciative that you find value, you will find value in this afternoon's conversation, and that it's important to you. That is much about the Confluence 2022 that we'll talk about here in a moment. But I simply thank you for choosing to be here. My name is Catherine Moore. I have the honor of serving as president of Georgia Conservancy, and I'll talk about our organization in just one moment. But if you'll join with me, I would just like to give a nod of appreciation, claps if you feel appropriate, but just certainly recognize the co-founders of Confluence 2022. They have put this week's worth of activities together, certainly with a lot of help, but it wouldn't have happened without their genius and their belief that this confluence, this joining together of the conversation around our natural environment and our arts needed to happen. So thank you to our week's co-founders. Thank you, and certainly with any endeavor of this magnitude, we are indebted to those that will host us and allow us to have conversations, have celebrations, have moments of reflection. So certainly I'd like to appreciate the leadership of this house of worship and its congregation for finding it important, again, to host today's discussion. Now, real quickly, it's not that I'm important, but I do believe very much that the mission and the work of Georgia Conservancy is important, so I'll beg your forgiveness for allowing me 60 seconds to tell you about our gathering. I opened just moments ago this lovely program, and one of our organization's founders, Congressman Jamie Mackey, is prominent in the message from the co-founders, so when you have a moment, if you haven't already, please make sure you read that. But let me suffice to say that Georgia Conservancy is a homegrown organization. Many decades ago, in the 60s, there were a group of Georgians that became alarmed about some things that were happening across our state. The coast, certainly here in metro Atlanta, in the mountains, in South Georgia with our forest and our agricultural activities, and began to wonder, what is the state of the future? There were no conservation organizations or environmental organizations at that time here in our state, and I'm simplifying, oversimplifying a lot of history to say that what ended up happening is that in 1967, 55 years ago this year, there were a group of Georgians that incorporated the organization Georgia Conservancy, believing that it was critical that there be a voice for both the conservation as well as certainly the sustainable use inherent in the definition, of course, conservation of our state's land. And why? Because the land is the host of our resources. So we are celebrating our 55th anniversary this year, and I'm a planner. I think I'm the first planner that has served as president of Georgia Conservancy as a planner. I love maps, I love data, I love lengthy reports, the thicker the better, bring it on. But I'm not going to be that person necessarily, I'll confess, that's going to inspire love of natural resources. Hence, we need our artists. We need different talents. We need different skills to awaken in the minds of those who have perhaps seen nature as something ordinary and not yet extraordinary, or have not yet noticed nature. And that's critical. We must all join together to think about our state's future. And certainly, I'm focused on Georgia, and we're going to have conversations about the broader Southeast today, as we should, but all of our nation's resources. And again, I think it boils down to something very simply. We experience, we love, and then we conserve. I can help with the conserve part, The experience has to happen on an individual and a personal basis. The love has to happen on an individual and personal basis. But that experience, not all of us have the means or the opportunity to again see a precious place in person, or again, maybe we're seeing something that's in our backyard we're taking for granted. We need the types of voices we're going to hear from in just a few minutes and across the week to inspire us, to bring us to that point of love. And then there are people like me that can help with the conserve part. So I want to thank our co-founders and our host for allowing me just a few moments to put a little context to today, but certainly the week and the importance of this gathering together of different approaches so that we all might experience love and conserve our resources. I'll encourage you to take a close look, if you haven't already, to the itinerary for the week. And I'm a little biased about one event next Saturday because my colleague will be leading a tour and conversation of the Okmulgee Mounds in the Macon area. If you haven't already signed up, please consider doing so. It is our hope that any day now, or in the future, if we're not successful this legislative session in Washington, D.C., that we might see the status of the Okmulgee Mounds National Historic Park be advanced to a park and preserve status. Regardless of that legislative activity, it is absolutely a precious place in our state, and I hope that it is one of the activities across the week that you'll consider participating in. If there's any information I can provide you about Georgia's ecology, and especially the confluence of Georgia's ecology and economy, I'd be happy to do so to discuss that mission that's part of Georgia Conservancy's work. But you want to hear from some other folks this afternoon. So I will allow others to take over. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, my name is Pearl McCaney. Eudora Welty writes that making reality real is art's responsibility. Something partly achieved, she says, by a cultivated sensitivity of observing life. Making reality real with their arts is why we welcome Margaret Renkl, Janisse Ray, and Dwight Andrews here today to this historic and spiritual space of First Congregational Church that is committed to the causes of social justice, equality, and reconciliation, accomplished by its core of their ministries, that is, community outreach. Thank you, First Church, for welcoming us here. I wish to briefly introduce our artists before the conversations begin. Margaret Renkl sees in her backyard, literally and figuratively, how the environment is changing, both naturally and by human actions. In her New York columns, her books, Late Migrations, A Natural History of Love and Loss, and Graceland at Last, Notes on Hope and Heartache in the American South, we see and hear the dilemmas we face: love and loss, hope and heartache. Margaret navigates these seemingly disparate responses to the world, both to wake us up and to encourage us to action to, quote, hold back the barbarians, as she puts it. Janisse Ray writes to discover and consequently to inspire direct action. Janisse, in her first book, Ecology of a Cracker Childhood, as does Margaret in Late Migrations, creates out of the confluence of the natural environment and personal and family history. Where does one find oneself, and how does one belong to and thrive as part of nature, giving to the world rather than always or only taking from it? In her recent book, Wild Spectacle, Janisse invites us, maybe implores us, to seek, quote, wonders in a world beyond humans, what some call the world of the more than human, rather than the non-human. Both Margaret and Janisse create art to help us see and to act. Dwight Andrews is, in my definition, a Renaissance man, not choosing between vocation, Christian ministry, and avocation, music and wordsmithing, but rather combining all calls for the enrichment and betterment of our mutual communities in an acceptance and an understanding of our shared history. In his powerful essay entitled A Problem, Art, Race, and History, printed in the Confluence concert program at Symphony Hall last night, Dwight concludes, art has the capacity to build community through shared experiences. To hear yourself in song, he writes, of another is the power of art. This is our passport to a transformative future. The job of the artist, Dwight says, is simply to create art. Addressing the confluence of the environment, arts, and activism, Margaret and Janisse will each read from their work. Then Dwight will have an equal time to comment on the topic. Following that, Dwight will guide a conversation among our three guests, himself included, and then conclude the program with questions previously submitted by audience members. After the program, Margaret, Janisse, and artist Billy Renkl, Margaret's brother who is here, will be happy to meet you in the fellowship hall to sign their books. Please welcome Margaret, Janisse, and Dwight.
I want to thank you for having me here and echo the sentiment of gratitude that you gave up a gorgeous Sunday afternoon to come to church. I thought I would read a little bit from each of my books. The first one, I hesitated to choose this essay. I hope it doesn't make some of you, I don't know, feel a little creeped out. But I was, there's a prominent Georgian in it, and so I thought it might be a good idea to highlight some of the important conservation work that's being done in your state. And also because I have a little bit of a fondness for rattlesnakes. This one is called, this is from Graceland at Last, and it's called The Misunderstood, Maligned Rattlesnake. The cabin my husband and I borrowed last week was first built in Kentucky on our friend's family land more than 100 years ago. The timbers are rough-hewed, and you can still see the bark on some of the beams. The builders conserved every inch of the trees, though to them the forest must have seemed endless. Our friends dismantled the cabin in 1987 and brought the timbers back to Tennessee, where they built a new cabin on the Cumberland Plateau. It is now perched at the edge of a windswept bluff overlooking Lost Cove, one of the most biodiverse places in the world, right where the heavens come together with the earth. In the 5 days we spent there to celebrate our anniversary, we walked in an endless garden, Queen Anne's lace and forest tickseed, Carolina horse nettle and narrow-leaf vervain, annual fleabane and zigzag spiderwort and ox-eye daisies were all growing untended on the side of the road. The woods were filled with songbirds, blue jays and goldfinches and tufted titmice and chickadees and bluebirds, and even the secretive scarlet tanager. Tanagers generally keep to the treetops, but the trees growing in the soil of Lost Cove reach up to the edge of the bluff. From our own perch, we had a bird's eye view of the trees. We watched a pair of red-tailed hawks teaching their fledglings to hunt. We listened to the pileated woodpecker's wild cry from the top of a dead tree and heard a red fox barking in the dark as two barred owls called to each other, who cooks for you? At Lost Cove, the nights are as beautiful as the days. The fireflies come out to fill the forest, just as the stars come out to fill the sky. The sound that woke me in the first stirrings of dawn one morning was the cry of a small animal, a mouse perhaps, or a chipmunk, in the claws or jaws of a predator. It was a piteous sound that came from directly beneath our window. The creature cried out just once and then was silent. I've mostly made peace with the fact that the peaceable kingdom is anything but. All day long and all night long, too, every creature on that bluff, like every creature deep in the cove itself, and every creature in my suburban yard in Nashville, and every creature scurrying down every city alleyway, is both trying to eat and trying not to be eaten. An insect hunting scarlet tanager is not inherently less violent than the owl that eats songbirds. A rabbit is not somehow better for eating wildflowers than a fox is for eating rabbits. This is how the natural world works, and there is no wishing it were otherwise. But knowing about such suffering is not the same as being a witness to such suffering, and I did not go back to sleep that early morning. My ambivalence in this matter of mortality explains why I was both completely fascinated and completely terrified by the juvenile rattlesnake my husband found curled up next to the front porch of the cabin later that day. I was afraid, but I wasn't only afraid. I was also a little bit in love with the magnificent creature calmly surveying us from behind a laurel, making not a sound. Really, what 30-second wedding anniversary would be complete without the appearance of some perfectly timed memento mori, in this case, a deadly pit viper, or without an ensuing marital debate? It has to be a copperhead, my husband said. They're all over the place up here. Rattlesnakes are rare. The markings are all wrong, I said. It has to be a timber rattler. It's way too small to be a timber rattler, my husband said. Rattlesnakes don't start out 5 feet long, I said. Throughout this lengthy conversation, which I have truncated for the sake of your sanity, the snake in question did not stir. It was utterly motionless. So still, it provided what my husband believed was unassailable evidence of his point. If this is a rattlesnake, why isn't it rattling? A former student settled the question after my husband texted him a picture of the snake. Jackson Roberts is now a doctoral candidate in herpetology at Louisiana State University. And he confirmed that, in fact, we had been visited by a young timber rattlesnake. You were really lucky to get to see one, he told us. They're very shy, and they're becoming more rare as we clear out their habitat and as people kill them. I asked Mr. Roberts why the snake hadn't deployed its trademark warning device. The rattle is a last-ditch defensive strategy against predators, he said. They'd much rather hunker down and wait for trouble to leave. To a rattlesnake, in other words, we are the trouble. We are the predators. Timber rattlesnakes are declining in many states, including here in Tennessee, and it is illegal to kill one. It's actually illegal to kill any snake in Tennessee unless it poses a direct threat to you. Thing is, snakes don't ever directly threaten human beings. Unless you're the one posing a direct threat to the snake, if, say, you step on it or you're trying to kill it, a snake will simply sit quietly, and wait for you to go away. Barely 2 days after this peaceful rattlesnake entered my ken and installed itself in my dreams, the Orion Society, a conservation nonprofit based in Tiger, Georgia, started a new initiative to celebrate rattlesnakes. Every day of the month leading up to World Snake Day, on July 16th, Orion is posting clips on social media of Chief Executive Chris Jenkins talking about snake biology, safe hiking in rattlesnake country, what to do when you encounter a snake, basically anything that might encourage people to stop killing rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes and snakes in general are the most misunderstood, the most maligned, the most persecuted animals on the planet, Dr. Jenkins said in a phone interview. One of the most important things we can do for the conservation of any snake, and rattlesnakes in particular, is education. A fear of rattlesnakes is not entirely unfounded. My first cousin's maternal grandfather died decades ago after he stepped on a rattlesnake too far out in the woods to get medical help quickly. To the snake, he was a threat. To his family, that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered to them was that he was dead. But the truth is that an animal can be dangerous and still pose almost no threat to people. According to Dr. Jenkins, snake bites are rare, and up to 50% of rattlesnake strikes are dry bites, in which the snake doesn't actually inject venom. Nevertheless, our culture has taught us to associate serpents not only with danger, but with evil. The only antidote to these associations is information. Unless you're actively trying to catch or kill a rattlesnake, the chance of being bitten is very low, said Dr. Jenkins. Many more people die every year from horses, whether they get thrown off or kicked, than from snakes. Many more people die from bees and wasps. If you encounter a rattlesnake, you should be excited. It's a symbol that you are in a wild place, a special place. It's hard to imagine a time when rattlesnakes, no matter how shy and how peaceful, will be welcomed without fear. But I like to think we can still complicate our perceptions, as my friend Erica Wright writes in her book, Snake. Perhaps we can yet learn, as she puts it, to recognize the grace alongside the fangs and venom. Complicated, sublime, awful and beautiful together. When we checked in the last light of day, our rattlesnake visitor was still resting quietly in the flower bed. By morning, it was gone, vanished into the dappled forest or the shady crevice of that ancient limestone bluff. We never saw it again. And I'm going to read just one from Late Migration. This is a little more personal and a different approach to the natural world. This one is called Be a Weed. Sometimes when I haven't slept, or the news of the world, already bad, suddenly becomes much worse. The weight of belonging here is a heaviness I can't shake. But then I think of the glister of a particular morning in springtime. I think of standing in the sunshine and watering the butterfly garden, which is mostly cultivated weeds punctuated by the uncultivated kind that come back despite my pinching and tugging. I think of the caterpillars on the milkweed plants, unperturbed by the overspray, and the resident red-tailed hawk gliding overhead, chased by a mockingbird and 3 angry crows. I think of the bluebird standing on top of the nest box protecting his mate, who is inside laying an egg. I think of that morning, not even a morning, not even an hour, and I say to myself, be an egg, be a mockingbird, be a weed. Thank you.
When I was a young woman, at the exact time I was learning to write, I began a study of oppression. So in a time when I was laboring to find my voice as a writer, I was struggling to find my voice as a human living in the 20th century of the U.S., a country founded philosophically on the ideals of freedom and rights, but built ironically and tragically on subjugation and extermination of entire groups of beings. I was raised to be godly and quiet, to be good and good-looking, a Southern girl in a subset of uneducated, dirty fingernailed, whip you if you don't sit there and act right, working class people. Once I was grown, I was lucky enough to fall in the sphere of people who worked for world change. Those were the words they used, world change. People who were members of peace coalitions, banked at credit unions, marched for civil rights, came out of closets, quit shaving their legs, quit straightening their hair, drummed with other men in circles on full moons, sent their children to alternative schools, didn't pay war taxes. Their motto was reimagine everything. That I fell in with radicals makes sense, but I have been a shock to my people. Oppression flourishes in silence, which is why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Silence is required of us on so many fronts. Never do I teach a workshop without writers grappling with silencing. We are silenced by our family's values, by the economic class we occupy, by our educations, by our races, by our genders. Fear silences us. Loyalty silences us. Sometimes love. Most of us are taught very well to be silent, so much so that we internalize the silence and censor ourselves. And yet, in a world beset with oppression, it's apparent also that transformation is an essential movement. The human seeks to transform. Coming from darkness, all of us, from nothingness, we continually pursue light and somethingness. We desire to be transcendent, to be effervescent, to be magical, to be of the Spirit, because we know that we come from Spirit, and to Spirit we return. Individually, we are driven to shape-shift into better versions of ourselves. which is why we get an education, go to church, volunteer. Transformation is how our bodies heal. There are many ways to transform. Transformation is rebuilding. I chose to be a writer because I learned that transformation happens through stories. Stories the way I know, having listened as a child to my father telling stories of transformation from the Bible. I believe in the power of story to change one little life or the entire world, because I have seen this power with my own eyes. Many people are better writers than I. Many are better defenders. Many despair less, grieve less, question less. Many despair more, grieve more, question more. But my life has been a decades-long apprenticeship to the power of story to transcend and transform. I've strived to find my voice and be proud of it, to be careful not to cause damage with it, but also not to pander or pretend or accept or turn my head and ignore. The search for voice has been a search for courage. In story, transformation happens in a moment of change called epiphany, glorious flash of insight, which is what makes literature so powerful. Change also happens quietly over time, like wind erosion. In high school, one of my English teachers, David Raby, assigned me a question: what is true greatness and what would that mean? I struggled because I was not reared to think about greatness. I was reared to think about making a living, having faith in God. So this question opened me up to the idea that greatness can mean many different things, and that I too might wish for it and attempt to reach it. I think greatness is the leveraging of all the avenues of transformation in order to become a transcendent human. As Howard Zinn said, transcending the here and now, transcending the madness of the world, transcending conventional wisdom, transcending the dominant narrative, transcending the word of the establishment, the orthodoxy, meanness, division, oppression. If you think about oppression, you have to think about power, and there are two kinds: hierarchical, power over, which leads to sad and even horrific conclusions. But the right and just and necessary kind of power is personal power, which believes in the potential of yourself and others. It's the ability to make your life go well. The source of my power is love of language, inherited from my father, and also the Elizabethan Bible. Anglo-Saxon language, figs and grape leaves, fire burning, rod parting the Red Sea. In childhood, I learned language, memorizing Bible verses, poems, listening to stories. The source of my power is words, the depth and range and strength of them. The source of my power is my hand, holding a pen, the pen moving, the words building. This is not a power to be taken lightly. Worlds can be created with words, with language, with the spirit bonds between words, and worlds can be destroyed. Writers have to be careful. We are a people starving for story. Corporations have taken on the job of telling us our stories. In the silence created by the pandemic and by this industrial life, we lose track of our own. It's important to gather them up, these stories. Useful stories, I think, are radical in that they help us see freshly. That's what stories are for, to help us see, to reinvent, wrote William Kittredge, the author of Taking Care, Thoughts on Storytelling. We need stories that will drive us to care for one another. All the creatures, stories that will drive us to take action. We need stories that will tell us what kind of action to take. Corporate culture is a bunch of lies, which are one more form of oppression, and we get tired of lies, so we seek truth. 2, stories are an antidote to a vast and growing isolation. Capitalism needs a workforce, so it asks Americans to give up homelands, families, clans, landscapes, to travel wherever they're needed. We leave the people and places we love. For these things, we never go back. Because of that, the philosopher Kathleen Dean Moore surmised, we lead lives not of quiet desperation, but of relentless separation. We read stories because it is an invitation into the homes and minds of another, places increasingly difficult to enter. We read them to find out if another human has learned something that will help us live more meaningful and happier lives. We read them to be more humane. I'm going to read just one last part and thank all of you for being here on this gorgeous Sunday afternoon. Thanks to Jane Thorpe, and who brainstormed all this. It's her brainchild. And last night I was fortunate enough to hear The Marshes of Glen that was composed by Stephen Darcy, who's in the front row. It was a transcendental moment, really, to see that kind of genius pouring out so much love for the coast of Georgia. And I almost read up here a story of Okefenokee Swamp because it's right now threatened, just dramatically threatened by this titanium dioxide mining company, Twin Pines. The other really amazing thing happening in Georgia is this movement toward a national park. So I thank you for keeping those places really hot in your heart so that you too can step up, hear their stories, and do what needs to be done to save these broken places. Once I heard a chaplain pray at a commencement at Warren Wilson College. He said that much of the work of the world is to be done in far corners with little fanfare or acknowledgement, with limited resources. He offered a new crop of graduates to God, put them in hard places, he said. Much of the work of art is to be done in far corners, daily, invisibly, with little succor, with limited resources. If that is what you do, my prayer for you is for you to be put in hard places. Because only by telling our stories and imagining new ones will we create a world in which we can all lead lives more meaningful and sensible and fulfilling. May your stories be easy to find and to write. A friend some time ago sent me a quote from Adrienne Rich. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And so, with you, my friends, old and new, my lot is cast. You who, with few extraordinary powers, with hearts full of love, with hearts that brought you here today, continue the work required to reconstitute and heal ourselves, our relationships, and our world. Thank you for all you do and have done for this wild, broken place, and for all that's before you to do. Because life is utterly fragile, unendingly fascinating, ceaselessly beautiful, humbling, awe-inspiring, divine.
Good afternoon, everyone. I really shouldn't be here. They are so eloquent in their descriptions of the very things that we think are so important. I feel really not only honored, but just happy to be in this room. I do want to say two quick things that are very important to be said today. I want to acknowledge Jane Thorpe and my friends at Meridian Herald for this extraordinary experience that we are all taking part in, and for the long-standing work that they have been doing on all of our behalves for so long. Jane, you are amazing. I called Barack Obama last night and said, when I run for president, I'm calling you to be my person. So, amen. I'm just kidding. I really did not call Barack Obama. Because someone's going to go home and say, you know, he talked to Barack Obama last night. Just kidding. The other thing I want to say, of course, though, is to my friend and brother, Steve Darcy. That evening yesterday was amazing. And he's here with us, so I think we need to acknowledge him. What it takes to put together the music that you heard last night, I can't even begin to kind of understand fully. But I do know that the kind of expression that we heard out of Steve's mind and out of his soul and out of his hand that we heard with our ears is a gift of God. And it's a reminder that if you live with something and commit yourself to something, it can be a story worth telling. And Steve, I was just awestruck by the depth of the music. You forced me to not try to analyze, well, what did he do with the percussion or what was the arrangement? But you brought me square to the music and to the story and to the text. And so it was a brilliant effort, and you should be very, very pleased. Thank you, my brother. You did a great job. So we've heard these wonderful, inspiring words, and they were wonderful and inspiring. So me being the provocateur that I always am, I try to come and kind of build on what you all have laid out for us today, because I am learning day by day something of the power of nature in our very midst. And so thank you for your writing, for your work, for your advocacy. But I want to, in a sense, respond to some of the things I've been thinking about very, very hard over these last several months that has to do with the confluence or the intersection between art and justice, art and spirit, art and entertainment. And I've been coming to a couple of conclusions. So I'm going to share with you just a couple of thoughts, and then hopefully when there's time for questions and answers and our conversation, we can unpack it a little bit more. I think you are right, Janisse, about personal power of telling our stories and the power of telling our stories and learning about not only ourselves but one another through stories and through storytelling. And Margaret, that's what I was alluding to when I said hearing ourselves in each other's song, or seeing ourselves in one another, or seeing ourselves in one another's stories. And one of my deep sadnesses of the present moment in our world is the way in which we have privatized our stories. We literally don't see ourselves in one another in the ways that I think makes for meaningful engagement. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I won't try to analyze it all, but I know, for example, that when I think of great art, I think of great art as being transcendent in the most important way. That is, I can read a Toni Morrison novel, and I don't have to be a black woman to appreciate the story that's being told. I can go to a Shakespearean play, and I can appreciate the drama and understanding the power of betrayal or doubt or disappointment or mental illness. And you don't have to be Elizabethan to understand the power of Shakespeare. It's the way in which art particularizes a story to a particular person, a particular time, a particular place, but it speaks to all of us across time and across generations. For me, that's what art is. And art, my friends, is increasingly different than entertainment, which is not the same thing. I'm beginning to become quite cynical about the idea of entertainment because entertainment calls us away from hearing and seeing and understanding ourselves in one another. Entertainment is literally a diversion. It's divertissement. It takes you away from what's real and what's important. It's a way to kind of keep you from the hearing of one another, the exchanging of one another. And so it brings me back to the idea of personal power because, first of all, in order for me to tell my story, I have to feel that I have the power to tell my story. And part of the way in which racism and oppression works is it helps or keeps people from fully appreciating their own capacity to tell their story. They think that their story is the one that's being told to them about them. And that's one of the unfortunate things about the realities of entertainment today. We have children and young people who want to grow into what they see on TV or on the computer or on TikTok. They don't see themselves as being empowered to discover themselves, but rather to become what they've been told they have to be. And this is the oppressive part of entertainment because entertainment, my friends, is an industry. It is commerce. It is not driven by us becoming more familiar and understanding one another. It's just the opposite. It's driven by a way to, how do I capitalize on division? How do I capitalize on a marketplace and a market identity? And I've become much more cynical over the years because one thing that we've learned in the 20th century is that commerce has become increasingly sophisticated. And with each new technology, it has begun to, I think, diminish the art. The artistic expression, those who are willing to take time to create an artistic expression, those who are willing to take time to read a whole book and not the Cliff Note version, folks that are willing to be engaged in a long conversation, not a short one. And that's what makes today so exceptional. We listen to people read readings, and we actually sat and listened. I said, wow, this is really something. Listen, it's quiet. We're hearing their thoughts, which they've taken a lot of time to prepare in a particular way. And we're giving it the space to breathe in and through us. And there's something radically exciting about that. There's something radically exciting about giving ourselves time to be in conversation with one another. And so, personal power is important, but first one must realize that they have the power to tell the story. And with the few wonderful artists that I've had a chance to work with over the years, people like Steve, playwrights like August Wilson, August had a story to tell. He understood that he had something to say, and he would not let the world tell him what his story was. It was sometimes painful, it was sometimes difficult, but the power of his plays was that they spoke to all of us. You didn't have to be black and from Pittsburgh to understand Fences. You didn't have to be a blues musician to understand Ma Rainey, to understand how race and commerce come together to do all kinds of things, not always wonderful, but often entertaining. That's the key. And so, with the people that I think have stories to tell and are willing to tell it, I want to provide a landscape, an environment, if you will, where I can receive fully the story that they want to share. I want to create a world in which young people and old people can discover themselves in one another. That is not the world we live in. We could not have the division that we have were it not for being divided and parsed into many different groups, thinking that our own stories are only our own stories. And then deciding on top of that, that our own truth is the only truth. that you have your truth, I have my truth, and let's go to our respective truth corners. That's the absurdity of the present moment. And I think what's exciting is we're reminded that if we are willing to open ourselves to the power of art, we can be transformed. But my friends, we have to give it the time that it needs in order for that transformational act to happen. There's profit in the soundbite. We understand that. But soundbites prevent you from going deeply into anything. It's the least common denominator of an expression. And it's driven to a very particular end, not necessarily to helping us to understand nature or the world around us, but rather to quite a different end. When we talk about the trauma of racism and oppression, when we talk about the things that we know are all around us all of the time, I think we begin to make change by understanding the capacity that each one of us has to actually engage in artistic expression and the receipt of it. That's the most important, that we see power in ourselves. We don't have to have a law. We don't have to have an edict. We don't have to have some kind of legislation to allow the powerful parts of our stories to be told, and to be told truthfully and honestly. But it does require a certain amount of courage to hear that. When I wrote the essay about race and art and history, part of our challenge, not just in the South, but in the world, is the way in which we manipulate history to be his story, not necessarily my story. And oftentimes we don't get a chance to confront it squarely because we want to diminish the ugly parts of it. And it is ugly and beautiful at the same time. To be honest and to be authentic is to embrace the all of it and to confront it squarely. It's our denial of our history that allows us to not want to have critical race theory or history that teaches history in a way that people might feel bad because their great-granddaddy was held slaves. But isn't that an ironic way to think about what history is? We don't want you to feel bad about the truth. We just want to maybe keep that part from you so you'll feel good about yourself. Well, that's not, I think, what liberates us in terms of what history is. It's when Steve and I confront squarely our respective stories and hear ourselves in each other, that we move beyond our history and are liberated by it. But that's the requirement of all of us. We have to go beyond our respective corners if we want to see true change. Now, I want to just leave you with the fact that as I was thinking about the birds and all of the wonderful things that you guys were describing in nature and the friendly rattlesnake and all of that was going on, I was thinking about one of the most prescient aspects of environmental racism that I experience, and that is the way in which poor people and brown people and black people live in such toxic neighborhoods and environments that it's pretty hard to think about the birds overhead when there is sewage in the streets and when there's toxic lead in the buildings and when no matter what, it doesn't seem to give us an opportunity to make basic change in the toxic environments that we've created. And I think for all of us, this is the charge that I would give all of you today. I think we must be more intentional, not just about preserving the beautiful nature that we all share, but we have to rehabilitate and reform the environments, the cities that we created that are toxic waste dumps for those that cannot afford to live somewhere else. That is not their job. That's our job. If you go to different parts of Atlanta, go to Vine City, if you go to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and look at where the oil refineries are and where the black people are. And look at where the garbage dumps are and where the black and brown people are. This is not a mystery. This has been driven by commerce and by power and the most abusive types of power. When we see generations of children being affected because they did not live in clean environments, then we all have to take responsibility for the reality of all of that. But I do think that there's power in us changing not only the landscape, but the ways in which we live in the landscape, so that we give people an opportunity to hear each other in each other, to see each other in each other, and to thrive because of the transformative power of art. I want to thank you all for just being here with us today. This is so exciting that we're having this conversation. But look around. This is a primarily not African-American audience in a historically African-American church. There's something going on here, isn't there? And we need to fix that. We need to fix that because the environment is our environment. The art is our art. And we need to find a way that we can truly share it in a meaningful way. Thank you all very much. Testing. Well, mine's on. Can you hear me now? I couldn't resist. Okay. We said we were going to try to give ourselves a little bit of time to have a conversation, a sharing amongst ourselves, and then hopefully we can also take a few questions. I've been given a few. Is yours on? It will be. Okay. Let me see. I've become a techno master. Testing. Okay. A word of acknowledgement. The technical director today is my wife, Desiree Pettislow. She's the only one that knows how to turn these doggone things on. So thank you, dear. Appreciate it. Okay, we have some question time and conversation time, but I'd really like to begin by asking each of you, given what you've heard from one another, impressions, first thoughts. I don't want to make it overly formal, but what are the points of confluence in terms of our three presentations today? What do you think?
You okay if I go first? I love Margaret Renkl and her work, and I've been following her for a long time, and just so glad that on a national level she can rep the South. I think the South has gotten labeled in this dominant narrative that I'm talking about as a certain kind of a place, and it isn't. And we've been really fighting against that for a long time. And then here comes Margaret, who actually she has a doorway into a national audience that can say, well, things are actually more complicated than that, you know? And also, so just one other thing, and that is, like, listening to the stories, there's so much power. Like, change is inherent in those stories. And it only takes a few pages to reach somebody's heart. And then they think, oh, the next Timber Rattler I will not kill. I will watch it like Margaret Renkl did, you know?
Oops, are you on? Nope.
It's green though, the light.
It's green. Let's see. It is green. Testing. Okay. You just let's see what we're testing. Okay, now we're on. You go ahead. You're good.
The thought, I was listening to Janisse talking about story, because I know this is something that we absolutely, completely are in accord on, but you are so much more articulate about why it is that stories are so empowering, and not just to the teller, but to the listener. And then it's the empowering of a story. In a way, it's a kind of sharing. It's what you were talking about, I think, in the reciprocity, the giving back and forth. When you tell your own story, you're trusting the person you're talking to with it. It's an act of communion. I had an interviewer one time ask me, you almost always start your New York Times columns with a story, usually from your own life. And I say, that's right. And he said, but why should we care? And I was so startled. I mean, I was just like, whew, I don't know how to answer that question. And all I know to say is what Janisse said, but just that when you hear someone's story, you understand that you've been trusted. And that makes you more inclined to trust another person with your story. And that back and forth that you were talking about, I think, is healing, for lack of any other word. We are wounded as a culture right now, and we need every medicine we can find. And I think that what Janisse said is 100% correct. That's our medicine. It's trusting each other with our stories.
Both of you, oh, there it is. It must be the battery because it's coming out and coming in. Yeah, we'll just swap. But I'll start and then we'll swap. For the both of you, how important is it that your story becomes a point of departure? That is, could you do what you do without including kind of your own particular place of being in terms of the writing that you do? Or is that kind of a requisite for being able to do what you do? That is, starting with your own sense of personhood, place, space.
I learned a long time ago that people's minds don't change because of statistics. I mean, let me just stop a minute and talk about statistics. We're in a terrible place with the climate crisis in the South. The South is the least prepared region for the climate crisis. And I can tell you, I can tell you how many named hurricanes there were last year, how many landed, how many caused more than $1 billion of damage, how many miles of coastline we have, how many southern cities are in the top cities that are prepared to be, that have to get prepared for rising waters. So all those statistics I can lay out for you. But the reality remains that statistics don't change hearts. You have to change hearts and minds with emotion. And with emotion, you're in terms of a writer, you're using all these tricks of the trade, of creating character, of using the elements of craft. So, yeah, that's enough said. That to me, the question that the reporter asked Margaret was itself an oppression, which is what the question was really saying is, why do you dare to think that your voice is important, which is another way of trying to silence Margaret?
I don't actually think he was doing that. I think he was pitching me a softball, but I wasn't really, I dropped it. But I think that's what he meant for it to be. I think he meant it to be an invitation to articulate what it was that I hoped to be the case. But to answer your question, I once wrote 109 pages of a novel, and then I stopped. And I at some point I hope I will try again. But it's easy to become discouraged by something that is hard, like really hard. And that many, like a novel is just giant. But a poem or a little 1,000-word essay, that's a sort of a small, manageable little chunk of words. And starting from your own life removes a lot of the fear and a lot of the anxiety as well. So I think in some cases, starting with your own experience where you are is pragmatic. But I also think that it's for a certain kind of kid, and I think Janisse was one of those kids. I was certainly one of these kids. The landscape that you imprint on, you're like a baby duck. That is who you are as much as anything, your family, your parents, your siblings, your school teachers, the landscape you grew up in, especially for people my age who grew up in the South before air conditioning, who grew up in a place where when the wind blew outside, you felt it inside. When the rain was coming, you smelled it. When the birds sang, you heard it, and the crickets at night, that became your life. It's very hard to separate the two.
Let me ask you, we're going to share so that we can keep this going. One of the good questions that we received was, who do you write for? Who is your audience, or who do you see as your audience? And then the second part is, what would you like your audience to be? Who would you like your audience to be? Would you change it? Could you broaden the landscape? You tell me, who's your audience and who do you write for?
I never figured this one out. I don't sit at my desk and think who my audience is and I'm writing. What happens for me is something very different. I sit there and think, I have been given a few minutes, just like I think today. I've been given a few minutes of your time. What can I offer you that may move my life forward and your life forward? So when I really mean this, I sit down to my desk and I say, make of me a vessel to do the work that needs to be done. And whoever reads it, wherever it goes, great. But I try to make myself a vessel. I just can't get over preaching, can I?
And I say amen. I think that a lot of any kind of conversation about audience has to, is it not working? Okay. It depends, really. I mean, is the audience the subscribers to the New York Times? Is the audience the Twitter mob that's going to read only the summary or look at the picture attached and have an opinion without actually reading any of the words? Is it going to be a group of school children? Is it going to be a group of young writers? Who's the audience? I mean, it sounds a little like you're pandering to say part of what needs to be said depends on what people need to hear, but it is partly that. And I think, like, for example, with the Times, it's my ultimate goal to make people recognize that the South is far more complicated, nuanced, and beautiful place than the rest of the country believes it to be. And all the good and bad that comes with complexity. In the book I just turned in on Tuesday, I'm pretty happy that I turned that in. It's a long way from being finished because my editor hadn't gotten back to me yet. But that book, when I was coming up in school as a young writer, we were taught that the very kiss of death for literary art was to have a message. Like, the very worst thing that you could do with imagination is corral it into a statement. It should resist a statement. And I do 100% believe that. But on some subjects, I no longer think we have the time to spare for misunderstanding. And I think the changing climate, and the absolutely devastating loss of biodiversity, and how those two things so severely impact our already most vulnerable populations, we can't wait for people to go, oh yeah, I think I see what you're saying. It has to be clear now. I mean, sure, tell a story of a human dynamic and a family that's going through a crisis. Be as nuanced and as open to interpretation as you want to. But we can't wait anymore. We have to say, wake up. This is happening, and we don't have much time to stop it from being absolutely cataclysmic.
I want to add to that last part and say that most of the dominant narrative of climate change is actually, I think, not complete. So, for example, just on the news this last week, the news is that we have to become an electric nation. Nobody ever talks about why we will not be able to just mitigate the climate disaster without forests. Are you understanding me? Like, we have to now, right now, stop cutting down trees, stop clear cutting trees, and begin replanting and restoring our forests, or we will not reach climate goals. So what we have been doing with the climate change, sorry, I didn't mean to point at you, Margaret, it's not you. Sorry, I'm gonna sit on my hand. What we've been doing is using the same capitalistic values to just relook at this brand new horrific threat. And it can't be done like that. we have to change. We have to change from the bottom up the way we look at everything we do.
I hear the sense of urgency that both of you are sharing, and I'm wondering, to your comment about the South, how much responsibility does the South bear in terms of not rehabilitating its image to the wider world?
Ooh. Okay, I'm not a sociologist, and really, or anything. So I'm just spitballing here. But I think two things are true that are sometimes set up as opposites. And one is that we are a terribly flawed people. And we have an original sin in the South that no other part of the country has, and that's slavery. And we aren't ever gonna be able to make recompense for that no matter what we do. That is true. But it is also true that our original sin is not ours alone. And I think that what happens a lot of times in this country is that people go, oh, all those Southerners, they're racists. And I go, yes. And then I say, and so are all y'all. Because that's the truth. And so what happens, I think, is that we become the repository of all the nation's collective ills and sins. And we don't deserve that. But we absolutely deserve our own sins. One thing that I think we have done, and I attribute it really to the two-party political system. If you look at polls of people in the red states, you will see a huge divergence between what people in those states believe about everything, from climate change to LGBTQ accommodations and welcome. People are perfectly fine in Tennessee with transgender children using the bathroom that matches their gender. But you wouldn't know that from the Tennessee General Assembly. So there's a great disconnect between the people's positions, the vast majority of people. In most of these red states that have not yet expanded Medicaid, look at the polls. 70% or better want their states to expand Medicaid, but they consistently vote for political leaders who don't do the things that they say they support. And there are a couple of reasons for that, I think. One is, well, this is going to sound a little bit paranoid, but it's the oligarchs. It's the people with money pouring very small, for them, amounts of money into local congressional races, local school board races, local everything. It doesn't cost much to buy a state legislator in Georgia. They're cheap. If you're a rich person, they're cheap. So all you have to do, if somebody's not in line when it comes to voting for Medicaid expansion, when it comes for voting to protect standing forests, when it comes to protecting vulnerable populations on every kind of level, and they threaten to step out of line, then all the oligarchs have to do is threaten to run a primary challenge. And most people, while they know how they feel about climate, while they know how they feel about tolerance, while they know those things about themselves, they have priorities. The priorities are complicated, but they have priorities. And yet when they go in the voting booth, they just are going to hit that R or they're going to hit that D without even thinking about it. So it's hard to convince people that there's a great disparity between all of us and the people who represent us in the political arena.
That's terrifying to me, because what it suggests is that people may be thinking one thing, but that we have a political system that disregards what people are thinking, and that thinking can in fact be assuaged by money. Several years ago, I spoke at Chautauqua, which is a little resort up in New York, and Bill Moyers gave a big talk, and he said one of the things that has destroyed or threatens to destroy American democracy is money. The ways in which this is no longer an issue of parties and ideas, but rather money and purchasing power, and that is now governing not just national politics, but local politics. I'm just wondering, given what you just described, and I think we all know that there's a truth to that, have we not failed the citizenry in terms of helping people to critically think about making sure that their opinions, however diverse, get heard? Or why is it that we now live in a political environment that is so easily bought by money, even at the local level? And I absolutely agree with you. I mean, Georgia is a great example. It doesn't seem like the diversity of opinions is reading up in the legislatures, or especially the votes. So is that our fault? Have we not been critical enough in our voting activity and voice? Or is it that we just, I'm just confused. I don't know where we are, because I think we're in a dangerous moment in the United States. It's not just about the environment. It's that the environment is really yet another lever that is waged by those that wield power. So even if we know about clear cutting and the dangers of it, big industry is determining that we're going to clear cut, and then it'll be too late. I'm just trying to figure out, how do we not leave this wonderful church sanctuary depressed? So somebody help me.
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, because I think that we should talk about hope. I think we should talk about what we can do. But I want to preface what I'm going to say next by saying that we aren't powerless, but it's also not solely our responsibility. And it is in the interests of the market economy for us to believe it's all on us, for us to believe it all depends on whether we decline the straw in a restaurant, on whether we drive an electric car. It all depends on personal choices, and it doesn't. It very much doesn't. It depends on political will. And here's what I know about politicians. They will do what we tell them to do if they believe that if they don't, they will lose their job. So there's a lot of forces against our empowerment. There's a lot of voter suppression. Y'all know that. There's a lot of gerrymandering. Y'all know that. These are not secrets. Everybody's perfectly wide open and transparent about what they're doing to keep the power vested in a minority of American citizens. We all know that. But here's a story that happened in Tennessee just a few weeks ago. The governor of Tennessee has decided he wants to privatize public education in our state, and he announced in his State of the State address in January that he was going to hire this Christian college to open 50 charter schools in the state of Tennessee. He asked for 100, and the president of the university told him 100 was not feasible. He wants 50 charter schools that are going to celebrate American patriotism, and we all know what that's code for. No critical race theory, the opposite. To make American patriots is the goal of these schools. And none of this is surprising. But then what happened next is very surprising, because that same president of Hillsdale College was caught on undercover video at a fundraiser talking about school teachers. And he said that, first of all, school teachers are in the dumbest program in the dumbest colleges in America. And he said, you don't even really need to have a degree in education. Anybody can be a teacher. So let me tell you what, you don't go messing with American school teachers. And it did not take long for the school teachers of Tennessee to go, hey, wait a minute. Even though it was summer and school was out, there were protests, there were letters, there were card writing campaigns, offices were flooded with phone calls, and guess what? The Tennessee General Assembly that had been applauding wildly when Governor Lee announced this program started going, there ain't going to be any of those charter schools in this state. That's what we can do. And we can do it on climate. We can do it on biodiversity. We can do it on social justice. We just have to do it.
The only thing I can add to that is amen. Amen. We are almost at our time, and I just want to thank you, Janisse, and thank you, Margaret, for an amazing afternoon and a conversation. I hope you all are left with the hope that Margaret has just given us, that we just can and must do it, and we can make it happen. But on behalf of First Congregational Church and Meridian Herald, and I don't know if we're going to have Pearl's going to probably give a formal acknowledgement, but I also want to take a moment just as pastor of the church to say thank you all for being here today. This was a wonderful day. I want you to know that you're all welcome. I'm going to give a big advertisement. This building was built in 1908, and it was built by black artisans. And it was a celebration of the idea of Negro progress, and that in Atlanta, racial reconciliation was possible, and this church was an example of it. Booker T. Washington came and gave the groundbreaking speech for this church. And here we are, a century plus later, having conversations about how to move the ball forward. And so I just want to thank you all for being a part of that ongoing conversation. Blessings to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dwight and Janisse and Margaret. And that exactly is why we are here in this space. And Jane knew it from the beginning that this is where this should happen. The program today has been live streamed by Dwight's lovely, as Barack Obama said, fine wife. And you'll be able to see the program and tell all of your neighbors and your friends and the people that you do not yet know and do not tell your story to. Tell them to go to the live stream at First Congregational Church to watch this particular program. And now, one thing that we all can do is to make your way to the fellowship hall. You go out the doors, you can go down the stairs and to the right, or you can go out the doors into the elevator to the fellowship hall, and you can buy the books that tell Janisse's and Margaret's stories, and buy the book that Margaret's brother Billy Rankel, a very fine artist and illustrator, has made for children, When You Breathe. So we hope that you have enjoyed your afternoon. We hope that you are moved not just in your minds, but also, as Janisse says, in your hearts, to take some actions for environmental justice, for social justice, for the betterment of our communities and our stories. Thank you very much.
Should we go down the stairs?